Hey guys, welcome back to SwatStudes. Today we are going to do a quick tutorial on lighting for modeling portfolios. So this tutorial will be more focused on modeling artists to present their work more appealing. So it will be a really quick tutorial showing you how you can create beautiful renders like this with a single HDRI and the things you should look for, how to set up an HDRI, how to do your render settings, and how to do the basic shading of the character so that overall it looks more beautiful than a random screenshots from ZBrush or some other softwares, or some lights where you are not able to see proper details of the character. Like if you see this render which I've done in Maya with using Arnold, this is a 3D model given by Michael Milano. You can check his ArtStation for more of his work. It is a free model that he has given for RenderMan, and this is available for free in RenderMan website to download. So you can see in this models that this is a ZBrush sculpted model, and it has a lot of tiny little details that see clearly in this render. So most of the modeling artists do when they want to show their work in their portfolios is that they just do a screenshot of different perspective from the ZBrush itself. It does do its job of giving you the details on all the parts which you have sculpted or created, and that is in most cases is enough for all the people to see your work and judge your modeling skills. But if you are someone who want to upgrade your presentations to a further step forward, this will be a good start. So in here we are going to talk about how we can do a simple lighting with only one HDRI. So I'll be covering how to select an HDRI for this, and how to set up the scene from the scratch, and how to do the shader setup, how to do the render settings. And this one I'll be talking less about the theories and focusing more about exactly what should we do step by step to get to this output. So if you want to know more about creating variations or doing further in lighting, do check my other lighting basic tutorials so that you'll get an understanding of how you can create more lighting by choosing a reference lighting from other artists' works. So let's start by going into Maya. So let me explain the basic setup that you can do to get this. So you can see this one. I have downloaded this from the RenderMan website, and this backdrop and the ground plane is coming with the model if you download the Maya file. So you can create this kind of plane if you want to render the character with the BG itself, or else you can just keep only the character in the scene and just place a backdrop with a certain gray value. Later in the post-processing, with the use of Nuke or Photoshop or whichever the editing software you're using, if you are rendering a turnaround or video. So currently we are only going to focus on a single frame render. So you can use the same setup for multiple frames of render by choosing to create different camera angles or rotating the character. It's up to you. So the first thing we have to do when you get a model is to create a camera and fixing the best camera angle which suits to represent the character's details. Like you have to select the best camera angle which suits for your character to portray what kind of character or personality he has. So in this case we have an aggressive dynamic pose which shows he is going on a fight or something. So this is more of an aggressive pose, and we should choose a camera angle which shows all of these details, like the pose details of him. So let me first delete this current camera for now, and I am going to create a new camera here. So I'm going to create menu, cameras, and just a camera. So if you want to look through the camera, you can middle mouse, drag and drop the camera from outliner to here, or you can go to panel, perspective, camera 1, and you can enable resolution gate so that you can fix the resolution and the frame you are going to set for the render. So the first thing we are going to do is set the frame. For here, I am going to set it into a particular angle where I can get more information of his backside as well as the face. So since he's looking towards the screen right or right side of the camera, and if I turn it to see more of his face, you can see the details on the backside is covered by his body. So I don't want to select that. If you are planning to render multiple frames or camera angles, you can select as you like. You can go to top angle, close up of his face, it's up to you. So currently I am going to set this in a pose like this, where I am getting enough detail of his backside as well as his front side. And now the second thing would be to choose a focal length. So before focal length, let me go to the render settings and set the resolution. So currently I have set the image size to be 2K square because it depends on the character that you have to choose the width and height of the image size that you're going to render, because since it has comparatively equal width and height for the frame that I have chosen, I could use a 2K square image size. But if you are rendering, let's say like this, and let's say it doesn't have this weapon in his hand, the image size will be good if we put it into more of a portrait resolution. If we are rendering the character like this, I can reduce the width to, let's say, 1500, and it will fit just fine here. So choosing of resolution depends on the character's width and height and how the pose is. So you can choose to render like this, or you can render like this. It's up to you. And with different poses, you may not need the same image size all the time. If you are rendering a one pose like this and the another pose like this, maybe you can choose to go for a different width for that particular angle. So let me take it back to how it was, and you can even choose to not have any rotations in the camera other than the y-axis. So it's all up to you, like which pose you like. And then the next thing would be to set the focal length. So if you are doing a character, it is more like taking a photograph of that character. So mostly when it comes to portraits, photographers use any focal length more than 35 mm. So I usually put the focal length to be 55 or 85 so that I don't get the perspective distortion on the character. So the problem with focal lengths which is lesser than 35 is that if we go closer on the character, the face gets more perspective distortion because of the focal length. Because the more wide the focal length goes, let's say 15, you can see how distorted the shape gets. So if I go something like 55, now you can see you don't have that kind of distortion. The face is without any distortion. It's proper in its frame. So any focal length above 35 is good if you are rendering the character full frame. If you are going for close-ups, I would recommend focal lengths between 50 to 85, and going above those flattens the shapes a bit. So the importance of showing character modelings in the portfolio is that you have to show much more details and also the dimensions of that shape. You shouldn't miss those shapings of your models in the renders. So for that, you have to keep the focal length to in between 50 to 85. That will be a good point. You can experiment it if you want, but if you don't like doing experiment things, you just want to get the renders done, just follow these instructions. Just keep it between 15 to 85. So the camera focal length is done and the setup is like set. Now our basic camera settings is done. Once you're done, you can lock the camera so that you don't accidentally move or change the frame. And even if you move it into a separate angle, you can press this key on the keyboard and it will get it back to the previous camera position. So I'm locking it. And now the second thing would be to choose the HDRI. Or before that, we can go to the render settings just to show you what are all the current settings. So you can prefer to render it on EXR or on JPEG. It's up to you. Since we are not going to create like high intensity lights, JPEG also will work really fine. You don't have to set it here. If you're rendering and saving it from the Arnold render view, you can save it from there as EXR or JPEG. So both are fine. You are not going to need any other post-processing later. But if you are planning to do some color correction or grading on top of it after, I would prefer EXR so that you'll get that dynamic range of the image. If you are doing extreme color corrections or grading later, the JPEG will give you banding issues possibly. So you can plan it according to your need. So the camera's sampling will be important for you in the rendering, because the noises comes if you are not given proper samples to your render. Because of the noise, you can lose a lot of smaller details in your render, especially if you have sculpted a lot of tiny details. So you can lose all of that. Like let's say here you can see a lot of tiny bumps and this vein details. If your render is more noisy, then probably you're gonna lose all of this. So I'll give you some quick tips on how to set your render settings. But by default, when you open or create a Maya scene, it will be by default to 2 on all of this. But if you are rendering only with a gray shader and you don't going to do anything else on the gray shader, or sometimes people use triplets all in the character modeling just to give that waxy feeling. But that I'll explain if you want in another video. Here we are only going to look at a render which has some diffuse and a bit of specular. So we will be turning transmission and triplet samples to 0. We only need camera samples, diffuse and specular. So this will be the default values which you get when you create a new Maya scene. And then the second thing would be the Raydepth. So I'll put diffuse and specular 1. There is no glass materials. You are not creating any glass materials. You can put the transmission Raydepth to 0, and you can put the total. It by default will be on 10, but you can set it to 1. It doesn't make any difference unless you change these values. So another thing will be the lights. So and the textures, you don't have to worry about all the other settings right now. And now the other things I choose to put is the diffuse and direct and indirect passes. So since we are using only the gray, diffuse and speculars, the color and the specular in the shader, we only need the diffuse and specular direct and indirect passes. But you need this only to solve your noise in your render. When you are taking a final image, you don't need all of this unless you want to tweak something back later. So we are not gonna talk about this in this video. So these are all the basic render settings, and now we are going to select an HDRI. So for HDRIs, I would recommend POLYHAVEN. This one has a huge collection of HDRIs, and the single basic thing that you should look for when selecting HDRI is the dynamic range and also the hardness of the shadows. If you can see in this image, it creates high contrast shadows, like very sharp shadows. And let me say, the sharp shadows are not good for modeling portfolios unless you want to create some character lighting, emphasis some characteristic traits like the hard lighting, or with the hard shadows the character looks more aggressive, and those kind of traits will be more emphasized there. So unless you are going for that kind of look for your modeling the character portfolios, please avoid hard lighting HDRIs. You can choose outdoor or indoor HDRIs, but even if you're choosing any of those, I would say choose some HDRIs which are more overcast. So you can look at in the rendered balls here and understand how the shadows are in here. So you can see in this the shadows are so soft, and also look at how the contrast is on the ball. In here the ball is more completely white, and we are not able to see much of the shadows here. So I won't recommend that as well, because we will need some shadow information from the HDRI so that our characters like in here, if you are not able to get these shadows, there should be a contrast between shadow and highlight so that these kind of smaller details are emphasized or prominent in your renders. So if you don't have that contrast in your render or in your HDRI, these shadows will be more or less in the same level as highlight, and you will miss these shapes. These shapes are visible to us because it has a highlight face and a shadow face like here. So because we have this separation of shadow and highlight in each detail, we are able to distinguish all the details clearly. So you have to choose that also carefully. And another thing will be not to choose HDRIs which has higher contrast, which produces very darker shadows. So when you have, let's say, this part and these parts are comes under shadows, but you can still see much details in here because the environment HDRI contrast is not that high. So that also another point. Possibly if you're a beginner, you can't distinguish or understand by looking at a render image which one will be like a hard shadow and which one will be the giving you much less contrast shadows. So I would suggest to choose 3 or 4 HDRIs from POLYHAVEN and try rendering with all of them and see which one is more looking good for you and select one from that. So here I have already selected one light. This is called Artist Workshop. This is also I have downloaded from POLYHAVEN. This is the HDRI we are going to use. So the reason I have used this HDRI is because you can see it has very less contrast or very soft shadows, and we have enough contrast on the ball. I can see like clear shadows that is not really dark or not like very less contrasty. It has enough contrast. And if you're choosing integer, choose integers which has this kind of larger windows as a light source, and try to use HDRIs which only has a single light source as a main light. Because when you have HDRIs which has multiple light sources, it tends to add lights onto your shadow parts. Like if in here the light is coming from the screen left, and if there is another light which is casting light from screen right, you lose the shadows and you lose the dimension or shaping on the model. When you are rendering a model for your portfolio, it is important that whoever is seeing your work is able to distinguish or observe all the details that you've put into that character, or else it is a waste of time of yours. So it's really important that you keep this in mind when you are choosing the light. So always keep a low contrast HDRI, use single light source HDRIs. That's are the main things want to keep in mind when you're selecting an HDRI. So I have already loaded this here, and if the second and once you're loaded, let me break the connection and put it into the default rotation. And when you are loading a texture into the HDRI, I would usually recommend you to add a color correct node. You can create a color correct node by press tab on the keyboard and then typing AI color correct, and then add the texture first into the color corrects input and then add that color correct into the light. The problem with any HDRI will be that it will have a lot of colors in its texture. We don't want any color cast onto your render because it should be a distraction from the details you have just created. You want to show only the modeling part of your work and not the lighting skills. Here the viewers should focus only on the details of the model, not how you have done colorful renders or lights. You can choose to add lights with colors if you want, but that I would prefer, or I would say that could become a distraction. And we will talk about adding colored lights, like main light sources with some colors, and make it more stylish. That I will be explaining to you in a separate video. So here we have now created a light with texture. Now first thing, let's try rendering it now and see how it looks. And another thing that I missed telling you in the beginning is that setting your resolution. So currently I am rendering in a 2K resolution, but when you are showing or creating renders for your modeling portfolio, it is better if you have higher resolution than 2K. I would prefer to keep a minimum resolution of full HD, that is 1920 by 1080 as a base, so that it has enough pixels to keep all those details for the viewer. So if you go down below that, I think some of the details are gonna get missed in the render because of the lack of resolution in the image. So I would recommend you, if you are able to, go for 4K so that each of the details is there for everyone to see. Here if I go to its full resolution, you can see I have rendered this in 4K, and you can see how detailed or how clear each and every detail of this image is for anyone to see. But when you are rendering or testing the renders, I would prefer to keep the render in 2K or below. Like I would currently going to do this in 1K. So for when you are testing the renders, if you want to test it in lower resolutions, you don't have to change it here. You can come to view menu test resolution and go to 50% so that it will render only 1K image instead of 2K. So here the render will be faster. You can judge the lighting faster in here. So that will be another thing. So here I'm rendering this with the final shader. So let's not do that now. Like I am going to show you how to set up a shader as well. So I am going to create a new shader, and I would prefer to use AI standard surface, which is PBR based. So you will get accurate reflections and shader properties right. I wouldn't recommend you to go for Maya's default shaders like Blend or Lambert. It doesn't give you that result. So I'm creating an AI standard surface here. So let's try rendering it now, and you can see the lighting is now like the whole image is blown out. So this is because currently the value or the light color value is on 0.8, and our lighting is also, I think, is by default. Let me take this back to 0 because by default the exposure will be 0. That is why it was overexposing. So by default we are getting this result from creating a default HDRI with default render settings and default all the other default setups. So from here we are first going to create, or the first thing we should do after creating the light and rendering is to create that shape onto the image. So with the help of speculars in the image, you are able to see a lot of details in here. Like you are able to distinguish all these details in the lighting or on the character. But what if let me turn off the specular for now. I'm taking the specular intensity to 0, and you are not able to see much of that details now. So we are going to start the lighting from only with the diffuse, and I am going to put the base color value to 0.5, and I think this will be a good starting point for, or a good gray value for your renders. If you can go for more whitish renders. It's up to you, but I'm going to keep it in 0.5 for now. And for the backdrop, I have created another shader and with 0.18 value. So you can either put your brightness value in weight or in color. So if I put weight into 1 and the value into 0.18, it's gonna look the same. It doesn't matter. So you can use either of them. So I would recommend to keep the backdrop color more darker than the character, so that the character is more pushed forward and the backdrop is more pushed to the backside. If you keep the same level of brightness in here, you can see the character goes blended into the background and you are not able to distinguish much of the details. Your eye will go everywhere. All the areas of the image are in equal brightness right now, so your eyes will be distracted to all the other place. We should keep the eye focused into where we want the viewers to look. So for that, I would recommend to keep the backdrop darker than your render. Now you have set up all these things. You have created a light. So first thing you have to see is that if the light is proper in the proper exposure. What I mean by is that sometimes if you create a light by default and added a texture, that texture might not have enough brightness. So let's say it's like this. So you don't know if the character is properly lit or not. So most of the artists would think that the character is not bright enough. Let me pump up its texture value or color value so that it looks great in this. It's a method that you can try. It is fine, but the problem here is you don't know how to set up the exposure properly for the light. You don't know if the light exposure is right or not. That may create some problems, or you won't get the desired result in the end because of these kind of smaller mistakes. So I wouldn't recommend doing this thing like exposing up the shader value because you feel you are underexposed or you are not getting enough light on the character. You can always try increasing the light value to expose the character more, but sometimes that also can create confusions because you can overdo it and get these kind of results. So the proper way would be to expose the light into its proper exposure. So how to set up that, I'll show you. First thing you have to do is select a position in the render where the light is hitting the character most brightest. So here, since the lighting is hitting the character from the front side or the camera view, all part of the character is like lit in on the same brightness. So I'm going to select a part in the chest area. So I'm pressing or holding shift in the keyboard and clicking and dragging to create an area, crop area. So when I do that, you can see this button gets enabled. So if you can do region render from enabling here, as well as by holding shift on the keyboard and clicking and dragging. So holding shift, just click outside of the box and the render region will be disabled. So I am doing that, and then I am reading the values in here. You can see you can read the RGB values like 0.478 on red, 0.516 on green, and 0.568 on blue channel. And also the luminance here is 0.503. So this is directly related to the value we are giving on the shader. So if let's say I am giving 0.2, it goes, you can see it goes around 0.2 value in the luminance. So suppose if our light is properly lighting the character in its proper brightness, then whatever value we give in the color of the shader, it will be all visible in the luminance as in the luminance value. And if you are not seeing this RGB values in here, you can go to view, window, and select this pixel information. You can see it here, as well as if you press Ctrl I here, like not Ctrl I, it's just I, so that you can see this display pixel information turned on. So if I turned off, you can see it's not visible. So by default, when you're opening the render viewer for the first time, it won't be visible. So pressing I on the keyboard gets it enabled, and you can read the pixel values. So currently we are kind of closer to the value we have given. So it's good for us to keep that light. If your value is different than what we have given here, like we have given 0.5 here and the luminance value is, let's say, around, if I'm changing this to any other value, let's say it's on luminance value here is gone down to 0.312, which means it is underexposed. We should be getting a value of 0.5 if you are giving a texture value, color value of 0.5. So it's not getting, which means the light is not enough on the character. So we have to up the exposure. So when we are putting 0, it goes around 0.509, and you can go a 0.1 or 0.2 above the value, which is not going to make much difference. But if you are choosing to put a value of 1, that's going to create some problems because most of the parts will be overexposed here. You can see So that is exactly why I don't want you to put higher color values on the shader, so that we will have enough control on the light for this. So once our exposure is set, and when it is done, we can find a good angle to position the light. Since it is an HDRI light, you don't need to move the light around. The concept of HDRI is that the light is coming from an infinite space of the scene. So we can use only the rotate Y of the HDRI to rotate the light and see if this is going to change the lighting. So you can see when I changed into so let's save this render here and let's change the rotation a bit. So you can see when I am for changing the rotation, you can just add values or just selecting rotate Y or highlighting rotate Y in the channel box and middle mouse click and drag in the viewport. So the values will change with it. And you can see when the values change, if you compare the current render with this one, you can see how moving the light into a side of the character gives its dimensions more. So here we were not able to see much details in here, but here you can see how much details are present in there. So the first thing you should do when you are rendering a character or a prop or anything is that try to rotate the light and create a dimension or shaping on the character by creating a part which has this highlight or getting light directly hit, and another part which has shadow information. So when you have this contrast, the details in your character will automatically pop up. So you can see all these details were not present in the first position of the light, and now it's clearly visible. Even here as well, like we are able to see all these details more prominently. You can see the difference, how much different it is. So if you are, let's say, rendering something which is not a character, which has this weird shapes or something that is a hard surface, like it can be a sphere, it can be some similar shapes like a cube or sphere, and cubes are something that is very difficult to create a shape of. So in here as well, what you can choose to set up is that make sure it has one side which has the highlight, one side which has the shadow, and the other side, if it is visible, have a different tonal range than this. Like you can clearly see the difference in the brightness of each of the face, and it gives that dimension. Like we can understand that it is a cube, but if let's try bringing it back into this default value, and you can see we are losing that shape much more here because we are losing that contrast. Here all of the shape has similar brightness. Like you can clearly see the line here, or the edge here is completely gone because of the bad lighting angle. So placing the light angle at a proper position is important if you want to create more dimension and if you want to bring out more of these details from your models. So let's delete this sphere, and if you are having trouble creating or finding the angle for the character, I would suggest after setting up the character in a camera frame, place a sphere exactly on the position of the character and try rendering that sphere. And if the sphere shows you proper shaping like this, like if I am adding again, going back to the 0, you can see the sphere is more flat here. And if I am rotating it into the light into a side, you can see I am clearly able to distinguish the highlight side with the shadow side, and I am able to understand the shape more. So you can place a sphere and rotate the light to set it into a particular angle if you are having trouble with understanding the light shaping on your asset or your model. It will give you a fast judgment on how the lighting angle would be. So I'm bringing back the model again. So let's see how it's looking now currently. So this is more dynamic lighting, like just like in the one, but comparing with our final render, I think this has more darker area shadows than this, but that will be solved after we bring back the speculars. So if you are satisfied with the details here in the gray without the specular itself, you can use this as well. It will save you a lot of render time, because when you add specular, it will create indirect specular as well, and that will take a lot of render time, because indirect specular by default will have noise, and to remove noise we have to increase the samples, and that will add into render time. So let's position it in a more reasonable shaping. So I don't want to go more into the shadow sides, so that I may lose most of the details here. Here you can see with it's the details are more flattening out, so I don't want that. So I would prefer to keep it in a reasonable rotation, so that here, see, I can get more details and I am not losing that shaping in the character. So I think -60 is a good place where you can put here, and the rotation value will differ from HDRI to HDRI, so you have to find the spot which is working for you. And also you can also go rotate the HDRI into the opposite angle, so that you get the light coming from screen right, and that is also up to you. The thing you need to focus is that you need to make sure you are getting all the details properly. You are not missing the details when you are placing the light, and you are getting enough highlights or proper light brightness on all the areas, so that none of them are going too dark on the shadows, and none of them are losing the information there because of that. So here we can see there is a lot of noises here, and that is why we are not able to see the details there. So that is something that we are going to fix next. So here my intention was only to tell you how you can just download an HDRI, put it inside Maya, and do some a single rotation, and your portfolio render is set. That should be the intention. The next thing I am going to do is, let me add the specular onto here. So I am going to bring back the specular weight to 1, and you can see it has a lot of nice specular which adds more details onto the character. So if I quickly save a render, then add the specular, so that you can, like, we can compare the difference, what kind of more details that we are able to get with adding specular. So if you are not getting any more details even after adding specular, there is no use of adding specular in terms of getting more details. You can still add it if you think that it looks more beautiful, that your render looks more beautiful with the specular. So I'm adding the specular now. So it is clearly emphasizing the details which are already there much more prominently than with the diffuse only render. You can see that the shapings are more emphasized right now. You can see much clear details here. So that is the advantage of adding specular. It will emphasize or enhance the details much more than just the diffuse render. And the thing that you should keep in mind, that I don't recommend keeping the roughness value, like low roughness values in the render, because you can see it is giving this hard speculars on the character and we are losing details there because it's just white colors on there, and that is not a good thing, because we should be able to see what details are we have put there. So I would recommend a roughness value of 0.4 or above, 0.45 or above, and I don't recommend going above 0.5 as well, or 0.55, because then it again becomes like a diffuse render. So there is no point of adding specular if it is going to look like a diffuse render. So this will be a good sweet spot. You can see the details it is adding onto your render, and how it gives much more good details in here. So this is the basic lighting setup and the shader setup that you can do to get a good quality render with a single HDRI. Now we are going to go for the noise renders. So for noise, before you start adjusting the samples, I would recommend to go back to the 100% resolution that you are aiming to render in the final image, because the noise and details will be different in different resolutions. So we should be able to judge the final noise in our final render itself, so that once you have put all your time into setting up the sample values, and then when you are rendering it in the final resolution and you find out that samples are not enough, or maybe you were overdoing the sampling. So it is better to judge the sample settings in the final resolution itself. So now camera samples is our most important, our primary sampling, which will reduce the noise, but it is not like you can put higher values like 10 or 20 to get rid of all the noise. You have to look at each of the AOV to see where the noise is coming and adjust it accordingly. So I would recommend to set a camera sample of 5 as a beginning for the final render. Until the test renders to set up the shader and lighting, you can use camera samples 3 or 4. But for final render, I would recommend going for 5 or 6. That's up to you. I would recommend you to start at 5 and then see how much noise is still you are having in the render. So for this, I would go for crop renders, so that I don't have to wait for all the renders to finish to see which part has much noise. So here I don't see much noise there, and that is because I have already put the samples here to 3. By default, the samples when you create a dome light will be 1. So with 1 samples, let's see how much noise we are getting. So let me save this. You can see how much noisy is it. But by looking at just on the beauty render, we'll not be able to judge from where the noise is actually coming. So I would recommend not to do high samples just by looking at the beauty render. 5 camera samples is a really good sample for doing final renders. So that is why we are using this diffuse and specular direct and indirect AOVs, so that we can see if these AOVs have any noise, and we can remove that noise from there. So if I go to diffuse direct, it has this noise, it has more noise in this. And if you go to specular, this one also has noise. So first I am looking at direct passes like specular direct and diffuse direct, because the direct noise in the direct passes comes from the light. So if you see noise in the direct passes, just increase the sample of the light you are using. So let's go for 2 and see if it has any better. So when you're doing region render, I think your bucket size should be smaller so that more cores of your processor gets used in the render. Because if your crop region is small and only the bucket size is big, then even if you have 16 cores, only you can see only 4 cores are being used here. So I will set it to a smaller number so that all the cores in my system or CPU is being used when doing region render. On the final render, you can set it to 64 or 32. If it is 4K, you can set it to 64. If it is 2K render, you can set it to 32, so that it is kind of balanced with respect to the render time. Because if you set the bucket size too small for larger resolutions, the render time is going to increase a bit, because the tile size is very less. The core can take much bigger size of area of the image to process or sample. So keep that numbers in mind. I'm just telling exact numbers to do here, and I'm not explaining why the process or theory behind it, because it is more focused on modelers, which people who doesn't want to get involved in these technical things, where they just want to set some numbers and render it. But sampling is not like that. It's gonna affect the render time, so you need to have some understanding in this. So we have removed the noise very much by just setting the samples into 2, but let's save it and put it into 3 to see how much it's gonna reduce again. So I still see some more improvement in the noise here. You can, if you are able to see, you can see. So usually if you don't want to test these numbers, you just put the number 3 in the DOM light. In my experience, I have seen like most of the time setting the samples into 3 deals the noise better, other than 2 or 1. 1 you will definitely gonna have noise, and 2 is okay if you want to keep, like, you don't want much render time, you want to adjust the render time, keep it in 2, and you have to deal with the noise if the noise is present. But if you don't want to, then keep it just 3 and render. But still there will be some HDRIs which still shows noise even if the sample is 3, and at that time either change the HDRI or go for higher samples than 3, and you're gonna get good results. And the second thing I'm going to look at is specular, and you can see the specular also is drastically improved. There is no visible noise in there. And the next thing would be to go to diffuse and direct, and you can see there is a lot of noise in the diffuse and direct as well. But because of the beauty is we are getting a lot of light information or direct lighting in there, the noise in this part is not that visible. But if you go to the shadow side, it is visible there, and it is from the diffuse and direct. So if you have more direct light information in a particular area, sampling there for diffuse and direct noise, it's not going to be visible. So always choose shadow areas with more diffuse and direct noise, so that because that area will be visible in the beauties as well with that kind of noise. So choose shadow areas for sampling diffuse and direct. So by default we have already given diffuse samples to 2, but guess it is not enough, and I'm going to sample you again, increase it to 3, and we will see if it reduces the noise a bit, like far better than the previous one. But let's go for 4 also, like just to see if it is making a drastic improvement. Yes, it does. So sometimes if you have to go for like this higher samples in diffuse and specular as well, then you should reconsider going for camera samples, keeping the camera samples up like 6 or 7, and then reduce this to 1 value. That is also will be good for you, like the camera samples will be sampling the noise globally, so that you will get better results in that process. But that is something that you have to test for yourself. It may not work all the time, so sometimes it will be better to go for camera samples less and diffuse and specular samples more, or sometimes you just keep the high camera samples and low diffuse and specular samples. So we will try this after setting the specular samples as well. So for indirect, these things are used. So for the direct lighting noise, we are using light samples, and for indirect lighting, if it is in the diffuse, we increase the diffuse samples. If it is in the specular indirect, that is not really visible, so we have to choose an area which has a lot of indirect lighting noise. So let's sample here and look at the beauty if it is visible there, but I don't think it is. We don't need to do this much, but still I see a bit of noise there. Let's increase the sample value again to 3 and see if it is improving the noise. And you have to be really careful about increasing indirect samples like diffuse, specular, transmission, or triple S, because this increases render time like crazy. You just adjust a diffuse value or specular value from 3 to 4 and the render time will get double maybe. So here it's just 13 seconds and now it's 15 seconds. Now since we are region rendering, it doesn't make much difference, but maybe when you are taking the whole image, that 2 seconds for each area will contribute to 2 or 3 minutes more into the render. So keep that in mind. And currently now the render is more or less like really clean. So either you can finish it there, or you can try upping the camera samples to like 6 or 7 and reducing the specular to 3 and 2. But I'm not going more detail in that, because I think for artists who has no knowledge of lighting will create confusion. So that's it. It's a simple trick to get all these things. You just create a light, create a camera, set up your frame, set up the resolution, set up the focal length, create a light. And when we were adding light, I forgot to mention something, because when I did add a color correct because to remove the saturation from the light, because if you're selecting some HDRI, let's say this HDRI which has a blue sky, it will cast a blue light onto the render. So in that case, let's bring it back to the previous low resolution and just save a render. And I am going to reduce the saturation to 0 and see, you can see there was a color cast of bluish color cast there, and currently we have removed it so that there is no color cast in our render and the render is clean. And when you are removing saturation, you will have to adjust the exposure a bit more, because adjusting the saturation changes the luminance value of the image. So if you see here, the luminance value is reduced into something 0.49 something. So if I check it now, the value is around 0.435, which is, I guess, was underexposed. We'll clear that up in a minute. So keeping that saturation to 0 changes the luminance, and it brings back the luminance to around 5 here. So if you want to adjust or add some more exposure, I would suggest like adding a 0.2 or 0.3 exposure, so that it has that a bit of value there, and still make sure it doesn't overexpose the gray and washes out the details there. So I think I can bring the rotation back a bit, like 70 or something. Since the character's chest is flat like this, when you are positioning the light from the right side, it's flattening out more comparing to if you position it in this side. I think this one gives you better dimension in terms of the light rotation, like, because there is the angle which he has posed the character is like this. So here, if we are hitting the light from here, it has that rotation of the body that gives more dimension to the side. But if you are hitting the light from here, we don't have that much dimension there. That's what I feel when I'm rendering this. So let's keep it here. Let's try. Yeah, I'll go for middle -65 degree. So that is kind of matches with our previous final render, which I have done. So here you can see, comparing this with this one, I have added some color into the HDRI. If you want to create some stylized colors or something, you can go to the AI color correct in the multiply, add some color variation, and you will get that color in the image. Or else you can do this in the post processing as well, so that you will have more control over that. So once you added some color in the render and you do another color correction in the post processing, that could complicate things. So better if you want to add an overall color in onto the render, just do it in the post processing with Photoshop or Nuke. That is fine. So here because I am not gonna batch render this, I set the resolution to okay, my system froze a bit there. So since I am not going back and forth here because I can save image from here, so I'm not going back here to set my resolution to 4K from here. I can just select the test resolution to 200% and just render it from here. That will also gonna give me the same result. So comparing to my first render, I am not going to add any lights here. Just after getting a final image, so these are all the simple things that you can do to get a faster render in 1 hour or 30 minutes for your models. So for now, since my system is currently freezing a lot, I am going to do a low resolution render, and I'm gonna save this, and let's see how to save an image as well, so that the whole process is completed. So we started from here, the flat image, and we added some dimension. We first we started with the gray shader, and we added some specular. Then we adjusted the specular roughness, and we did check the sampling, and finally we got our final render here. So even if you can see that even my resolution is now 512 by 512, you can see the resolution here, and it takes a lot of time. That's what I'm talking about. If setting up a sampling into a higher values will give you this kind of huge render times, and if it is affordable for you, you can definitely go for it. If not, a quick cheat will be to add an noiser imager into the render so that most of the smaller noises will be denoised from the Arnold itself. For that, you have to go to the settings and into the post, and from the add imager you can add a denoiser optics, and you can clearly see that just by adding it, it gives clear renders. But the only drawback of this is that some of your tiny details on your model can be lost if you're using the denoise. In this render, since I was rendering it 4K, I did use the denoise. Still, I was able to get a lot of details here. So that is up to you. Like, turn it on and see if you're losing some details. And if you're losing the details, maybe you need to increase the samples, and then also use a denoiser with higher samples so that even some noise which are still present in the shadows and smaller areas, you can get rid of that and still get a lot of those details back with the higher resolution. So here you can already see that how much details, like it is a cleaner render. I am getting a lot of, like, I'm still preserving a lot of details even in the 512 by 512 resolution. So even if your resolution is higher, like if you're rendering in 4K, the details will be still preserved better compared to the low resolution images, because the denoiser has more pixels and more details to compare, and so if it finds like smaller variations from pixel to pixel, it will try to preserve that details there so that you don't lose all the details in your model. So if you want to save an image with the denoised version, you can keep the denoiser on and click on save image and name something, and it will save as a JPEG. So let's go to the folder and see. So here we have rendered and saved the file as image, and you can upload this right now to your profile. You don't need to do any other post-processing or any other things. So, and if you want to save it as an EXR, you can save multi-layer EXR. So before that, I would recommend you to turn off all these Aovs, because we don't need all of that. We were using that only for sampling purpose to reduce the noise. And after that, you can turn off this by clicking this checkbox and turning it off, and then just file, save multi-layer EXR and add a name and save it as an EXR, and you can open it in new Core Photoshop and do your post-processing there. And so that's all I wanted to talk about lighting character or asset for modeling portfolios. So I hope you liked this video and you gained some knowledge from this. And if you have any doubts regarding any of these topics that I have covered, just comment it on below, and I'll definitely gonna get back to you with an answer. And if you want more videos like this, that also you can comment it below, and I'll make another tutorial about that as well. And if you want more contents like this for look development and lighting, subscribe to my channel and share this with your friends who are more interested in lighting and look dev. Also share this video with your friends who are looking for some videos to get their work to have that better look on their portfolios. So I'll see you with another tutorial soon, and till then, this is Swat signing off.